This week on Inside Olympia, we meet two of the state's newest Republican lawmakers, State Representatives Peter Abbarno and Mark Klicker. Why did they run for office? What do they hope to accomplish? And what's it been like to navigate a mostly remote session? We'll sit down with them for the full hour.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
And welcome to Inside Olympia. What a year to begin your career as a state lawmaker. The Capitol is closed to the public, there's a security fence around the building, and most legislating is happening remotely because of the pandemic. So what's it been like for first-year legislators? Joining me now to talk about that and much more are two of the state's newest Republican state lawmakers. They are State Representatives Peter Abbarno and Mark Klicker. Welcome both of you to Inside Olympia. Once again, a virtual setting. I hope we get to meet in person at some point, but good to see you both.
Thanks for having us.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, likewise. Let me start with you, Representative Abbarno, just a little bit of your backstory. How did you come to run for the state legislature? What motivated you, especially in such a polarized time? Of all times, why would you want to get into politics? At least state politics.
Well, first of all, I mean, I represent the 20th district, which is South Thurston County, most all of Lewis County, East Cowlitz County, and Woodland down in Clark County. And for the past 5 years, I've been a city council member in the city of Centralia, where I reside with my wife, who's a middle school math teacher, and my two children who are 8 and 9. And, you know, it really starts with why I got involved in just the community, which was to make sure my community was a better place for my children. I looked around and saw that, well, what I thought I could do better and what I thought needed to be done. And when Representative DeBolt decided he was going to retire after a long and distinguished career, and Representative DeBolt is a good friend of mine, I decided to take all the work and things I've been doing at the local level and at the city level and expand that, run for state representative and try to do better not only for my community here in Centralia, but the entire 20th district and the state.
Great. I'll have some follow-ups for you in a moment, but Representative Klicker, your district is Walla Walla area. Same question. You know, why did you decide to run for the state legislature, and especially at this sort of time, this moment in history, and at a time when we are so polarized?
You know, it's interesting, Austin, and you have to look back. I think the trigger, or the light went off, and it triggered my interest in getting involved, basically, as Representative Abbarno mentioned, in the community, clear back in 1992, when I saw a turn with the political environment changing in 1992, and it wasn't necessarily the elections, but it was what was going on with the activism going on clear back at that time. We started seeing our forests being left untouched, the bug infestation, everything. So it had to do with what was going on in our environment around us. And the push was to leave everything alone. And then watching the political environment and seeing what the agenda was, I couldn't sit around any longer. So I decided to got involved with the George Nethercutt campaign clear back then. And that's where it started. I've been a farmer all my life, and I've had a number of businesses. And I worked for the Washington Farm Bureau, which really developed an interest and an understanding and a philosophy of we have to take care of what we have, but we have to manage it properly. So as I got involved in that, we basically had agriculture or farmer activism, and that's what really kind of stimulated my interest in getting involved as in elected office. But I really didn't take a real interest until this last year, realizing that I have to get involved, and I have to get involved in deeper than what I've done before. So that's where I am today.
Okay, we have the full hour, and so I want to explore a little bit more your political philosophies and how you got to be here and got to this point. Representative Abbarno, I was struck just looking at your background that you went to law school in Vermont, and I've been to Burlington, the home of Ben and Jerry's. It's one of the more liberal towns in America. How did you go from the University of Vermont Law School to being a Republican state lawmaker from Lewis County?
Well, my background, I was born and raised in Buffalo, New York, a real blue collar town, a Rust Belt city. And I went to college when I was 17 and got involved in politics, started working for a local mayor down there. I always laugh and say I started off with psychology, but I didn't do so well in psychology. So my mother said, do something you're good at. And she said, you talk yourself out of a lot of situations. So maybe go into politics. So I started poli-sci and started working in the state legislature in New York. Then I became the executive director of the Republican Party in the state of Vermont. Then I became the executive director of the Republican Party here in the state of Washington. It was only after the 2004 campaign with Dino Rossi that I ended up going to law school at Vermont Law School in South Royalton, Vermont. But I always intended after those 3 years, and I used to come back and work for the Attorney General's office, always intended to come back. So after law school, I came back to Washington State, went to the University of Washington for my Master's of Law in taxation, and stayed here. Eventually moved down to Centralia, met my wife, 2 kids, and now a state legislator.
What is just because you've been in New York politics and been and obviously seen that legislature and now here, what's the comparison and contrast you'd offer? New York is a lot of bare knuckled politics. It's a little rougher. But ultimately what I like about Washington State is, while we may have different values, we value the same things. And at the end of the day, we can't get to a compromise point to move our state along on virtually every issue if we listen to each other and work together on that item or that issue that we both value. I don't always see that, and I think you don't have to have been in politics at all to just watch the news and see that that is not common around the country. But I think in Washington, it's more common that we value the same things. We just may have different values to get there. Yeah, well, interesting. I'd like to explore that a little bit more in a moment. Representative Klicker, you are not a recent transplant to the Walla Walla area. In fact, your family goes back several generations. What is it that sort of grounds you in terms of your outlook and in particular your political philosophy?
Yeah, so we've been in the area since 1861. We've always been free enterprise, kind of rugged individualism, working to make things happen, not dependent on government. And that's just kind of the way the philosophy has been. We never ever took sides with any political party for many, many years. We stayed apolitical. The family did. The family always, for 103 years now, and my brother still operates and owns it, is a strawberry operation where we hired over the years, 103 years, probably over 50,000 kids. And so as you work with these kids, everything is kind of on a merit system where you earn your way to the top, and you work, the harder you work and the better you do, the more opportunity that you have. And so we've always had that philosophy. You can't depend on others, not necessarily completely, because everybody depends on each other in some way, shape, matter, or form. But we've always believed that being able to be a free enterprise company, farming operation, kind of directed us kind of towards that philosophy that would fit more on the conservative end of things. At the same time, working all these years with kids and their parents, you develop an understanding and a win-win solution for everybody. And so I've been able to carry that with me when I work in the Farm Bureau, working in my farming operations and my orchards, working with people. And so that makes a difference. So as Representative Abbarno said, we may have different philosophies, but we can find solutions to get to the same place.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you both about this, starting your legislative careers in the midst of a pandemic and having to do a lot of this remotely, where you're not getting to meet your colleagues in person and sort of experience the process under the dome, literally and physically. So, Representative Abbarno, what has this been like? What were some of your first impressions, and how, have there been advantages, and what are the disadvantages?
That's a really good question, Austin. So, a virtual session is good for, I think, passive participants in the legislative process. There's access at so many different points. I mean, you could access all the legislative hearings and the floor debates on your phone, on virtually any electronic device. But for active participants, people who really want to get active in certain issues, it's been pretty difficult. When there's committee hearings and we're taking testimony, you don't get through the list because folks are in a waiting room. They have to be led into a waiting room. They have to be unmuted. Then they have to be put back into a waiting room. By that point, you go through a fraction of the people who really want to testify about important issues. So that's been difficult. The other part is, we're in, April 8th, and I haven't been to my legislative office yet. And I've only met my legislative assistant once. And it's difficult because constituents want to send you mail, and it's got to all get scanned in and sent to you. So it's difficult. But the one advantage is that, as a freshman, you're usually very disadvantaged because of knowledge and experience. We're all going through this virtual session. So it kind of creates an atmosphere where we're all on a similar learning curve. So I think that's an advantage to freshmen who are coming in to say, the way you sponsor a bill, the way you co-sponsor a bill, the way you're sending messages out to your constituents are all now diluted, and we're all almost on an equal playing field. So I think that's good. The hope, though, is that we can get back to an in-person session and we can get back to in-person meetings, because I know that in my district, that's what people are really hoping to see. And I really am hoping we get back to that soon.
Okay. Representative Klicker, I mean, looking for silver linings here in Walla Walla, it's a heck of a drive over to Olympia, and oftentimes the roads aren't that great in the winter. So has there been an upside here, at least a shorter commute, or at least not having to move,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, I think that probably the beauty of virtual is you're in your own bed at night, every night. So that makes it really nice. But the disadvantage that we have is not having the opportunity to meet people within your own caucus personally. We are virtually, but the other people on the other side of the aisle. And that's huge, because I've always been a one-on-one person, being able to visit with people that have different philosophies or ideologies. And so not having that opportunity really provides a disadvantage. And it's interesting, we're in the breakout rooms, we're waiting, and you see some of the legislators that have been in there a number of years, and they have the conversations and small talk with both sides of the aisle, and we don't have that a chance to do that at this time. So really makes it difficult, especially when you're trying to work bills, because if you work a bill and you have questions, even people with your own caucus, you've got to pick up the phone, you have to call them, or you have to email or text, and it really puts a layer of really virtual red tape between us and the other people. So really we're lucky that we didn't have as many legislative bills this year as what's been going on in the past. So that's really our disadvantage, but the advantage is being home at night, weekends, you don't travel back to take care of a few things. It's it's right there kind of sitting in your lap. That is nice.
Yeah. Representative Abbarno, you said that you noted that you worked for the political party, for the Republican Party. You kind of raw politics and partisan politics are something you're acquainted with, yet you were talking about the potential for bipartisanship on a lot of issues in the legislature. And we're in an environment right now where you're operating virtually, where Republicans are in the minority, where majority Democrats are moving a number of very major pieces of legislation. A lot of change is afoot, and some of it is, quite partisan in nature. On the other hand, so far, the legislature is moving forward and being productive, unlike what's happening in Oregon, where minority Republicans have been able to really, I guess, leverage some of the different rules down there and slow things down. So I do think the public is sort of interested in this notion of what does a functioning legislature look like? What is the role of the minority? And, how is it working? And why does it seem to be still working here that you can sort of disagree agreeably or disagree vehemently on one bill and turn around and work across the aisle on the next one?
Well, politics and policy shouldn't be taken personally. I think you have to start with that. And you have to start with the fact that you have to approach it as if everybody, even folks on the other side of the aisle, are vested and doing it because they're doing it for the right reasons. I, as a state legislator, represent every single person in the 20th district. And quite honestly, when you're voting on bills that impact policy throughout the state, you represent everyone throughout the state. And you have to recognize that. You have to recognize that you're trying to do what's best for your community as a whole, but also to look to the future and say what's going to be best for the state. You often have to put politics aside when you're dealing with legislation and policy, but that doesn't mean that you give up your values, your morals, your ethics. You still have to represent those. And when you see a bill that comes on the floor, you have certain things in the minority that you need to do. One, you can try to kill it and say, this is just bad policy, and I think it's going in the wrong direction. You could try to amend it and say, I think we can make this bill better. It may not be everything I want, but it could be better, or you support it. I mean, those are really your three choices. And looking at my community, I represent Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Conservatives. I mean, every district's going to have a little bit of everything. And so I try to approach it and say, what's going to be the best for my community as a whole? I think the other approach, or I guess the other aspect of how you approach the legislature is no political party, no person has a monopoly on any issue. My wife and I, we volunteer at the homeless shelter. We deliver food boxes. I volunteer monthly in the classrooms of our schools, and so I'm in dealing with a lot of the issues that traditionally maybe someone wouldn't look at and say that's a Republican issue or that's a Democrat issue. And I think that's important because sometimes political parties and sometimes elected officials kind of find their niche, and then they don't think they can play in another sandbox. And that should not be the approach. You should always be able to have input and try to improve any issue, regardless of whether or not it's traditionally in your wheel well or not. So that's my approach.
And Representative Klicker, I have two thoughts going through my mind. One is just the urban-rural divide we see in this state and in this country. I'm also mindful of the fact that, for instance, former State Senator Maureen Walsh from your district was, you might say, her own kind of Republican. Certainly willing to break with the party at times, sometimes on pretty significant issues, and very independent nature. So I don't know if one or the other of those themes jumps out at you or kind of ignites your passion, or if maybe they go together. But as you think about representing a pretty rural part of the state in this state legislature and trying to be successful and productive as a member of the minority party, and also when you think about what success looks like at the end of the day politically, how are you framing that?
Well, good question. And I think if you look at my district as a whole is extremely conservative. Many rural people, and then the people on the outskirts of the cities, which Walla Walla, if you want to call that a city, of a little over 30,000 people. But if you look just at Walla Walla proper, is I guess you'd call it blue. It is more liberal, more Democrats in that. But as you move out into the countryside, it's very red. You get the western part of my district. It runs very, very red and very Republican, and even actually on the outskirts of Kennewick and those areas. But what we've been able to do, at least in our district, part of the district, over many years, I would say right around 20 years, we've developed a philosophy working with both sides of the aisle, primarily in environmental issues. And so we've worked out solutions, and many of the people have become very good friends because of that. And so just because we have different philosophies, different ideologies, we can find solutions. And there's a little bit of a story behind that. And it happened after really started with, it was the National Marine Fishery Service, which is called NOAA now, implemented these, what they called the 4D rules back in 1999, which would, to us, was going to shut down our waterways, shut down irrigation, all to protect fish, bull trout, steelhead. We got together as a group, environmentalists, farmers, ranchers, business people, government people, state and local and federal, and we found a solution. And it's taken us many years. So we can, I look at it, we can do the same thing in the legislature. But unfortunately, this virtual session, it's difficult to get that, at least get that started.
I believe that's been called the Walla Walla Way, right?
It is called the Walla Walla Way.
Yeah. So we're going to dig into issues here in a moment, but I want to give you both a chance to comment on and reflect on this moment that we're in. Obviously a pandemic, but also a moment that's been described as a time of racial reckoning. This is the week that Derek Chauvin is on trial in Minneapolis, the former Minneapolis police officer charged with killing George Floyd. A number of police accountability and reform bills are moving through the state legislature. Some have been quite contentious in nature. But as Republicans, as new members of the legislature, as representing more rural parts of the state, what do you think the legislature and the state should be doing in this moment to address inequalities, to address violence against people of color, to learn from what's happened and to advance progress, at least, in terms of equal rights, civil rights, and racial equity? And Representative Abbarno, I'll let you, just since we're not sitting together, I probably should call on somebody. So Representative Abbarno, why don't you take that?
Well, I mean, that's a pretty broad question. I think we need to focus on healing. And I think we need to look at, when we look at policies and we look at legislation and we look at past policies, I think we need to look at how they've been applied in the past. Because if we don't look at history, it's bound to repeat itself. And so, my focus always on these reform bills has been, how did we get to this point? Because I think that's important. Who's passing these laws that are being applied in an inequitable manner? How have we gotten to the fact that, we're in a situation where we're seeing what I would consider more extreme pieces of legislation to try to address issues that have been done in the past. So, for me, I've been trying to focus on what we have in common, how we deal with poverty, because I think the one universal thing that we should be focusing on is poverty across gender and race. We should be focusing on opportunity across gender, ethnicity, and race. Centralia was founded by our George Washington. He was an African American who was born in a time of slavery, I think his parents were slaves before he was adopted. And it's an amazing story of how this gentleman came from the East Coast to the West Coast, platted and found the city of Centralia, and brought all races together, and actually was the centerpiece of this community. And I think we need to look at those stories and those figures in our history and say it can be done. and that there is hope that we can get it done if we work together and we look at, one, how we got to this point, and then forward, how do we address it and find those lines and those strings that connect every single one of us and every one of our communities that's struggling. And I think that would be the best way to address inequities in our society.
Okay. Representative Klicker, one of the things that we hear a lot about, especially in the terms of the police accountability measures, is the notion of systems change versus, there's some bad apples who need to be weeded out, but this, generally the system isn't broken. And I see a lot of disagreement around and sort of different framings from the two sides on that front. But one of the things we are definitely hearing a lot from majority Democrats and for those calling for change is that it's the structural systems that need to change because baked into them are inequities. How are you thinking about this moment? And again, understanding you're representing a rural area, predominantly white area, although of course Eastern Washington has a significant Latino, Latinx populations, but where are you coming from on this?
Wow, this has been an issue I've struggled with for a long time. As I'd mentioned before, our family have hired thousands of kids over many years. And I say red, yellow, black, and white. So we've always looked at things in a colorblind way. And so we've never looked at color. I think so much of it's culture. I actually have a number of African-American friends, good friends, that have been part of the community for years. And I've worked with one just during the election. I called him up and I said, listen, I said, I'm really struggling with this whole George Floyd thing, the racist thing. Could you help me? He sent me a book. It's called Biased. And I read the book, listened to it audio. And I wish I could say I get it, but I don't. And there's such a divide and ideology. And I think what has happened is that the wall, the barrier keeps growing. I don't think we've been able to break it down. And so you see legislators, you see people in the urban area, so much of it comes from out of the area, of the urban area, and they don't understand us and we don't understand them. In fact, there was a bill that was introduced about agriculture equity for farming. So it would give Black Americans the chance to get into farming, not understanding that that's a cultural thing, that is a generational thing, something that has been started with families as clear back into the 1800s, and many of them understand it and they have grown into it. And now it's big corporations and big people with a lot of money to be able to start farming. You just don't step into it. Again, I think the lack of understanding on both sides. And so it's really difficult. What we have to do is be able to bring people over into rural America into the urban America, spend time with each other, live that life, understand it, maybe not necessarily for months or years, but really getting a feel and getting to know each other, that would help. Now, getting back to the people within the African Americans, within my community, like I said, I don't get it. There are things hardships they've run up against that we don't see. We're just good friends, but they run into that. And then one last thing is my son is a police officer, and he is now losing the things that protect him. And this legislation really has me fearful for his life and his health and his family's health. And so we have to be able to break down that divide and come together as a people.
On that note, we're going to take a brief break. We'll come back in a moment and we'll talk about specific legislation that you're introducing this year, legislation that you've been involved in, and we'll delve right into that right after this.
Keep up on what's happening at the state capitol. Watch TVW, the legislature, Supreme Court, and executive branch. For the unedited gavel-to-gavel coverage of state government you won't find anywhere else, watch TVW.
And welcome back to Inside Olympia, continuing our conversation now with two new members of the state legislature, Republican state representatives Peter Abbarno and Mark Klicker. Let's talk about some of the legislation that you've been proposing, voting on. Representative Klicker, you just mentioned police reform and the fact that your son is a police officer. The police tactics bill, among others, has recently passed, which would, among other things, ban chokeholds, restrict the use of, for instance, tear gas, require new model policy around the use of canines. Is there something specific within that bill or others that you're thinking about in the context of the work your son and others do and that prompts you to think that this goes too far?
Right. And really what it is just nibbling away at all of the things they can utilize. Very rarely do they ever use, at least in our communities, if ever, used tear gas or any of those techniques. You have the vascular type of maneuver, the chokeholds. Chokeholds are very, very rarely used. The vascular one has been used, from what I understand, but it's one that would, if only, would put them unconscious. And whereas a chokehold could actually hurt somebody. However, it's the techniques that they would be able to use, different options. A police officer does not have time or 5 minutes to think about, okay, let's see, what should I do? It's instantaneous. They have to figure it out. So as they continue to nibble away at new laws, it takes that safety method, the safety away from them. And that's why you're seeing so many of these police officers in Portland and Seattle leaving their career. They don't want to be exposed. And so that's the thing that they've noticed.
Representative Abbarno, I know you're a former deputy prosecutor up in King County, I believe. I'm interested to sort of know how you're thinking about this in the context of having worked in that role, having worked in King County. There's a quote from Senator Jamie Peterson, the Democratic sponsor of one of the key accountability measures, and he said, if we just stand by and watch black people continue to be killed by the police, we're guilty of allowing that, of tolerating that system to continue unabated. That seems to be what's animating him and many others this session and this year vis-a-vis these bills. From where you sit, from your perspective, do we do nothing? Do we do something? How would you be approaching this?
Well, and thanks, Austin. You mentioned that I was a assistant prosecuting attorney over in King County, but I practice a lot of areas of law, and I've also done criminal defense. And I think that my experience has taught me that there's always room for growth. I mean, I think it's foolish to think that we have learned all we need and can throughout our lives. We're always learning. We could always use training. We could always be better at our jobs. However, I think it's dangerous to make incendiary comments that really ignite passion to the point where people are digging their heels in on emotion, and I kind of lose pragmatism. There is room, and some of the police reform bills had good things in, and a lot of them, I believe, went too far. It's always dangerous when you look at legislation and you see that the exception to the rules are engulfing the rules. And I believe that the vast majority of law enforcement officers are doing the right thing, are moral, ethical, and are protecting our citizens. And so, sometimes when I hear comments that talk about the exceptions to the rule, which we must deal with, and it's not acceptable, but when we're talking about the exceptions, we should never forget the rule. And the rule of law enforcement is that, or at least the generality is, the vast majority of these law enforcement officers are protecting us, our families, our homes, our businesses, and doing the right thing. So, while reform is always necessary throughout our lives, whatever profession it is, We need to make sure that we don't take all the tools away from a certain profession and leave them in a vulnerable spot. And I think a lot of the reform bills going through the legislature now are doing that.
We'll move to a new topic, and let me ask you both about proactively what you're able to accomplish as new members of the legislature and as members of the minority party. Representative Abbarno, it looks like you have been able to advance a bill having to do with rural infrastructure investment. What's the idea here? What's the concept, and how have you been able to get some yardage here?
Well, yeah. So as a local city council member, I always teased and said that my love language is sewers. I believe strongly that our infrastructure under the ground has been neglected for generations. And what my bill tried to do is say we need to look at a more dig once policy, that when we're doing an infrastructure project, let's do it all, or at least consider all the infrastructure that needs to be done, and do it in large, more regional, cooperative projects. I've always been concerned or frustrated with the fact that a lot of these grant programs are small and they don't accomplish what they should. They're a $2 million match program or a $5 million match program, which may do a part of a project, but never really moves the project along to where it needs to go. So, my bill was able to, or was drafted to maybe deal with bigger projects on a dig once philosophy.
And just to be clear,
I'm really proud.
When you say dig once, are you meaning that you could be replacing the sewer and also putting in fiber for broadband at the same time? What do you mean by that?
Absolutely. Looking at when there's even a DOT project or a streets project or a wastewater project, when you're opening up the ground and you're digging, look at all the things that need to get done. Look at all the applications that have been in that region and say, should we expand this project because we've got needs a half a mile away? Can we get all these projects done? A lot of what that bill did or aimed to do was incorporated in the House capital budget, which I'm really proud of as the assistant ranking on capital budget. So a lot of that philosophy, while the bill didn't pass the House, the language and a lot of that language was incorporated within the capital budget. And so I'm looking forward to looking at some of these projects in my district and throughout the state and see how that works.
And your idea was a competitive grant program to support more local infrastructure projects. Of course, we have the Public Works account, but you note that has often been, money's been siphoned away from that for other purposes over the years. There's never enough money for all of those local infrastructure projects. Representative Klicker, what about you? Is there a bill that you've been introduced that you've been able to either get over the finish line or at least get part of the way through the process so far? Something that, as a new member of the legislature, as a member of the Republican Party, that you've actually been able to see some success on?
Right, yeah. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to introduce any bills this year. I introduced one, I withdrew that bill. It was a small bill, and I noticed that, learned as a new member that and being in the minority party, majority of the bills are not going to come from our side, which is no problem. But I was ready to start legislation, burning rubber, making it go. But you can't do that on flat tires. And with the COVID epidemic, my goal was to help businesses out, business recovery. And that's really what I campaigned on. But when you get into the legislature and then being stuck here and not being able to work in the chamber and under the dome, that changes kind of the way in your strategy, what you have to do. So I became more of instigating your new legislation for business recovery and working with the bills that they have, which that is a moving target as well, but becoming a cheerleader. And there's one bill that I'm really excited about, and that was House Bill 1168, introduced by Representative Larry Springer and co-sponsored by Representative Joel Kretz. And that is basically a large bill that would kind of introduce about $125 million this next biennium to improve forest health, do fire suppression, get new equipment for fighting fires, thinning, and we're working on a permit process. I am currently working on that right now, that we can do to basically make the permit process go easier. So those are some of the things that I have been a cheerleader on, but there's a number of environmental bills that Representative Abbarno and I are both on Environment and Energy Committee, and there's some bills that we've been really fighting to try to keep from passing. So more of a cheerleader type of role this year, and hopefully next year I have a number of bills I'm anxious to introduce.
Yeah, and I know certainly there was members were encouraged to limit their bill introductions this year. There was an expectation and an understanding that the volume would be down because of the nature of the remote session. I think we've seen that has been true, although it still seems like there's a lot happening and a lot moving. Speaking of these, so you mentioned forest health, which is an issue that seems to have brought East and West together. There's a lot of bipartisan work around that, and a lot of, I think, excitement around this investment and trying to address forest health. You mentioned environmental bills. Obviously, the governor is pushing for the low carbon fuel standard. There's a cap and trade program that's being contemplated. There was a bill early on in session that I know one or both of you were pretty vocal on. In its initial, I think, version, although this changed, it would have prohibited new natural gas connections to residential homes with the idea of phasing out natural gas. On this environment and energy front, what is animating you? What are you fighting most vociferously in these final weeks of the session? And either of you can jump in on this.
Well, yeah, thanks, Austin. So, and you're talking about, I believe, House Bill 1084, which would eliminate the use of natural gas in residential and commercial construction, new construction. There's a lot of legislation. I think Representative Klicker mentioned this early on, that people talk across each other, and you know, the art of communication and collaboration sometimes feels like it's dying on the vine. And I think it's important to take a step back and say, how can I advance my issue, but do it in a way that's pragmatic and helps the greater majority of people. I think a lot of bills that are introduced, both in the other two committees, aside from capital budget, but environment and energy, as well as civil rights and judiciary, those two committees that get introduced seem to be go a little too far. Sometimes I feel a lot too far. And then when amendments or issues are brought up to the contrary, people end up talking across each other. So I think it's important that, you know, what my goal is on both of those committees, and especially environment and energy, which Representative Klicker and I serve on, is to at least give a perspective from a more rural community, and a community that may not be able to react to certain pieces of legislation that are really urban focused, and don't consider how folks living in rural areas actually live their life and really want to continue to live their life in a certain way.
Representative Klicker, there's these bills that I've mentioned, you know, as examples of bills that have either been introduced or are still advancing. There's also, you know, the ongoing conversation that isn't front and center this session, but is certainly an ongoing conversation about the potential removal of the lower Snake River dams. When you sitting where you are in Walla Walla, representing that district, how are you thinking about that? Is your thinking evolving? Has it evolved over the years on that particular issue?
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on a great subject. I had a farm I sold in 2015 that was just below one of the lower Snake River dams, and for a number of years there's kind of two positions more on the environmental side. Some are calling the dams hydropower, green energy, renewable energy, and others are not. And so there's a little bit of a conflict of belief of what they serve. We believe that it's all green energy of the hydroelectric dams. It's renewable, and we probably should have more, especially with the technology, with the fish passage. They concentrate on the dams. There's 9 other dams above Lower Granite Dam in Idaho that have no fish passage. And so they concentrate on that. But going back to Representative Abbarno's comment regarding an urban philosophy, and really that philosophy starts right on the I-5 corridor. And I continue to mention this so people understand that is kind of where the ideology changes when you get into the I-5 corridor. And I think that's where we need to find some correction. Because so many of the people that are on these small little districts that are geographically small, but are heavy in population, have a belief what they really want to see. And I understand it. I get it when it comes to that. But to get to a place where we have renewable energy, if we get rid of the dams, we lose a huge part of our electricity. If we rely on intermittent energy, which is wind turbines and solar farms, we'll see what we saw in Texas. And so trying to develop that infrastructure in the time frame they would like to see, I really see as impossible. I'm a free market person. I believe free market. We all want to see it. I can't wait for my first electric vehicle. It'll be fun. Look forward to it. But we have to be able to get there, and I believe it's the market that needs to drive this thing, not government.
Well, and speaking, this kind of gets back to infrastructure as well, but there are proposals to allow PUDs, for instance, to get in the business of providing broadband service, because we know that there are, and this pandemic has reminded us of this and revealed it, that there are many parts of the state that still don't have access to high-speed internet. But I know that there's been some pushback on the part of Republicans around some of these proposals. Representative Abbarno, what's the sweet spot you're looking for here?
Well, I think there is a lot of room for public and private entities to play in the broadband arena, but I think the focus should be on trying to find the most efficient way and the best way to expand that infrastructure without creating a public-private competition. So I like the fact that we should be encouraging the growth of our private broadband companies. And I support PUDs building infrastructure, most certainly, but I don't support when public entities get the unfair taxpayer advantage of competing with the private industry. So I think whenever there's a rural broadband bill, the bills that I've looked at in both the Senate and the House, I'm always looking for something that deals with overbuild and deals with challenges so that we don't have some unfair competition, but that we complement each other, because I think it's important that the public and private broadband entities, or entities that will begin doing some broadband, don't compete but complement each other. So that's what I'm looking for. That would be my sweet spot.
And just a moment of pushback here on the idea that, I mean, PUDs brought electricity to rural communities. The argument, the flip side argument, and I think the argument you'd probably hear Representative Hansen, who's the prime sponsor of that particular bill, say, is that the private companies aren't getting the job done, or maybe aren't even offering service in some of these areas, and that the PUDs are positioned to and equipped to do this. And what's really standing in their way now is the inability to do it. I just am interested to hear your response to that.
Well, so rural broadband, I've never really even heard that word 5 years ago. The massive investments in rural broadband, the speed at which technology has evolved is more recent. And so with the influx of federal money and state focus on rural broadband, I think we need to give both public and private entities the opportunity to access that money and grow. So, I mean, you know, if private entities haven't been doing this for so many years, then it's only recently that PUDs have asked to do this. They could have asked for it 10 years ago. But this issue is, while internet is becoming a staple for everyone and a necessity, it's only recently that both the federal and state government have really focused on legislation and focused on funding mechanisms to actually grow and expand that. So I think we need to give an opportunity for both to access these funds and these opportunities. But again, even if they both access it, it's important that they don't compete. We need to be efficient with our money, and we shouldn't be creating a competition between the public and private sectors. And I think that's really important.
Okay, Representative Klicker, just briefly, anything on this particular point from your perspective?
No, and it'll be interesting to see what happens, because broadband, rural broadband is being pushed nationwide. And so again, I think that is a place where government can, state or federal, can have a part into making this happen. That's where the funding could help. That actually is one that I think is good, but it needs to be open for the opportunity. If one entity has more rights or exclusive, it's going to captivate the market and have more control of the market, and that's something that again will send us in the wrong direction. I think we'll see the expenses go up, and taxpayers will pay quite a bit more money, and our utility fees will go up.
Okay, let me just briefly, Representative Klicker, ask you about this bill, because it affects your district, to remove, well, I don't know if it affects your district, but it might be of particular interest to your district, to remove the statue of Marcus Whitman, which is in Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol, one of two statues that the state of Washington has, and replace it with a statue of Billy Frank Jr. There was tearful testimony even from the Lieutenant Governor who presides over the state Senate when this bill passed in that chamber, about the importance of this change. Is this something you support?
Well, I did. I supported it mainly because Representative Rood was able to negotiate and work with Representative Lakonoff in the bill that we'd be able to bring the Marcus Whitman statue back to the district. And for that reason, I was able to support it. You always hate to see something that is of value to you, that has a lot of meaning. I've seen it there at Statuary Hall myself. But there's some positives behind it. There's a number of states that are doing that now. They're starting to rotate, putting in, and I think that's well deserved. And the next tenure of Billy Frank it'll be good. We're bringing it home. We actually have a couple other bronze statues of Marcus Whitman that are identical to that in the area as well. So we'll have to find a place. But that's okay. The thing is, more people will be able to see the statue that's been there in Statuary Hall for over 70 years. So it's okay.
I just have a couple of minutes left, but I want you both to have a chance to offer your thoughts on the upcoming budget. I mean, kind of the last thing that is going to need to happen here is a final budget negotiation and a final budget deal. Obviously, Democrats are writing the budget. I don't expect there'll be a lot of Republican votes for it. It's likely to have a capital gains tax as a part of it, but you don't have a lot of power or authority here. But what's, just very briefly, your approach or principle here around the budget, Representative Abbarno?
Well, I mean, there's three budgets, right? There's
good
the
point.
capital budget, which
yes,
the capital budget, which
you can agree on probably.
Yeah, which we agree on, and I always like the capital budget. I'm so happy to be on it because the capital budget invests in communities. It's really a bottom-up type budget. Requests come in from localities of their needs, and we can invest in them and create jobs and create a bigger tax base. But as to the operating budget, most certainly the concern is going to be the rate at which the operating budget's growing and relying on new revenue like a capital gains tax or increased revenue sources by raising taxes. And at a time when we're seeing record revenue increases, we're seeing an influx of federal funding, I don't believe that we need to increase taxes, and I would caution against it. But as you said, the Democrats have the votes to pass the operating budget, and if they pass it with a tax increase, they'll have to own it because there will be nobody to blame. The governor's a Democrat, and the governor's the executive branch has been Democrat for 30 years. The Senate and House are both Democrats. So with an operating budget that increases taxes on working families and small business, they'll own it. And I hope that I hope that common sense accounting comes into play, and we don't raise taxes. But if they do, I most certainly would vote against it.
Okay, Representative Klicker, I have less than a minute left. Final word.
No new taxes, especially in a year where we are actually flush with money after we see what's in the funds that are coming in. Capital gains tax, once that passes, their foot's in the door. It's going to affect everybody in the future. It really, like Representative Abbarno said, they will have to own that, and that's up to them, because we're not going to vote for that.
Okay. Of course, they're billing it as a matter of tax fairness. They're saying it will be a tax on the wealthiest Washingtonians, not on working families, but it's certainly a hot debate in the legislature, that's for sure. So, State Representatives Peter Abbarno and Mark Klicker, new freshman Republican lawmakers, thanks for being here for the hour. Good luck in these final days, and maybe we'll all be back in person next year. Good to see you both.
Thank you, Austin.
Yeah, take care.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We will see you again next week. Thanks for watching.